There are moments in history when a decision is so desperate, so detached from reality, that it stops looking like strategy and starts looking like denial. In March 1945, Adolf Hitler made one of those decisions. With the Red Army already closing in on Berlin, with Germany's fuel system collapsing, with the war effectively lost in every meaningful sense, he ordered one final armored offensive in Hungary. Not to save the capital, not to shorten the front, not to rescue the collapsing eastern line. He sent his best remaining Waffen-SS formations into battle for oil. That single choice created the Battle of Lake Balaton, the last major German offensive of the Second World War, and one of the most brutal examples of what happens when an empire tries to force victory out of exhaustion. By then, the German war machine was already breaking apart from the inside. Allied bombing had devastated synthetic fuel production. Tanks sat idle. Aircraft remained grounded. Whole divisions could not move because there was not enough gasoline to feed them. The Reich was no longer running on power. It was running on shortages, improvisation, and lies. And yet Hitler still believed that one resource might change everything: the oil fields in southern Hungary. To him, those fields were more than an asset. They were a last chance. If the Germans could hold them, maybe the army could keep fighting. Maybe the front could stabilize. Maybe something somewhere would still turn the war around. It was fantasy, but it was the only kind of logic left in the bunker. And so, the order went out. The force chosen for this mission was not some exhausted rear echelon unit. It was the 6th SS Panzer Army, the most dangerous armored formation the Waffen-SS still had left. These were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived years of war and still knew how to fight with deadly precision. Their tanks were among the best the Germans possessed. Their crews were hardened. Their commanders understood the truth immediately. This attack made almost no sense. The problem was not courage, it was geography. The battlefield lay between Lake Balaton and Lake Valence, across a narrow corridor of roads, fields, canals, and low ground that was already turning soft under the spring thaw. It was one of the worst possible places to launch a tank offensive. Tanks needed space. They needed speed. They needed ground that would hold their weight and let them maneuver. Instead, the Germans were being sent into a landscape that seemed designed to trap them. Worse still, the attack depended on momentum. If the Germans could break through quickly, they might reach the oil region before the Soviets fully reacted. But if the assault slowed, even briefly, it would lose its main advantage. That was the fatal weakness. The entire operation was built around speed, yet the terrain was eating speed alive before the first shot was even fired. Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army, understood this immediately. His officers understood it too. Reports from the assembly areas described flooded fields, muddy tracks, and ground so soft that armored movement was already becoming dangerous. On paper, the offensive still existed. In reality, it was collapsing before it began, and Hitler would not stop it. On March 6, 1945, the attack began. On the Soviet side, Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin had been preparing for exactly this moment. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and deserter reports had all pointed toward a major German offensive in western Hungary. He did not know the exact hour, but he knew enough. The Red Army had time to build a defense not just across the front, but in depth. Layers of anti-tank guns, artillery positions, minefields, and firing zones that would make every German move costly. This was not a passive line of defense. It was a machine built to kill armored assaults. The Soviets dug in anti-tank weapons where the Germans had to pass. They registered roads, bridges, and crossings for fire. They prepared artillery to strike the routes that armor could not avoid. They placed reserves where they could seal any penetration before it became dangerous. Tolbukin was not hoping to stop the Germans at the first line. He was waiting to wear them down, to make them spend their strength against a battlefield that would not give way. The German barrage opened before dawn. The SS formations moved forward into the darkness and the mud. Their first job to clear minefields and open lanes for the tanks behind them. That alone slowed the advance. Every mine lifted, every obstacle removed, every congested road and blocked route delayed the timetable. And in a battle like this, delay was poison. The first tanks rolled forward expecting to break into open country. Instead, they found waterlogged fields, clogged roads, and terrain that refused to support them. Heavy armor that should have inspired fear became vulnerable to something far more humiliating: the ground itself. The Tiger II was supposed to be a terror weapon. So was the Panther. On flat, open terrain, both were lethal. But in Hungarian spring mud, their power meant less and less with every passing hour. A tank can destroy almost anything if it can get to the fight. The problem was that these tanks were beginning to lose the ability to move at all. Some bogged down. Some were forced back onto the roads. Some slowed enough to become easy targets. The battlefield was stripping them of the very thing that made them dangerous. And the Soviets knew it. Their gunners did not panic when the German armor appeared. They waited. They watched the roads fill up. They watched the columns compress into narrow approaches. They watched the SS formations struggle with the terrain. Then, they opened fire, where the Germans had no room to disperse. It was not one dramatic blow. It was a methodical tightening of the trap. The Germans were still fighting hard. That is what makes the battle so frightening. There was no collapse of discipline, no sudden cowardice, no empty front. These were elite troops, still trying to do their job under conditions that made success almost impossible. They pushed forward because they had to. They kept attacking because the order had been given. But every kilometer cost more than it should have. Every advance became a trade. Fuel for time, time for blood, blood for nothing. By the end of the first day, the breakthrough Hitler wanted had not happened. The offensive had made some progress, but not enough to matter. The Germans had not shattered the Soviet line. They had not opened the road to the oil fields. They had simply forced themselves deeper into terrain that punished them at every turn. That mattered more than the map line itself. A tank offensive lives on tempo. Once tempo is gone, the defenders can bring up reserves, adjust their fire, and reshape the battle. Tolbuchen understood that perfectly. His plan was not to win with one strike. It was to make the Germans keep attacking until the attack itself became impossible. And that was already beginning to happen. The roads were clogging. The mud was worsening. The Soviet defense was holding. German officers could see the shape of the disaster forming in real time. The men in the front vehicles were not blind to it either. They knew the terrain was wrong. They knew the timing was wrong. They knew this was not a battle launched from strength, but from fear. Still, the formation kept moving. That is what makes Lake Balaton so tragic. It was not a reckless charge by fools. It was a professional army being ordered to do something that professionalism could not save. The crews knew what they were facing. The officers knew the odds. The infantry knew the armor would not be able to do everything promised of it. Yet the offensive continued because the war had reached a point where logic no longer controlled events. By nightfall, the first cracks were visible. The Germans had not broken through. The Soviets had not been shaken. The ground had not improved. The battle was only just beginning, but already the atmosphere had changed. What had been sold as a decisive armored blow was turning into a slow, grinding failure. And the worst part was this: they had not yet reached the part where the battle would become truly catastrophic. The first day ended with tanks still moving, men still attacking, and Hitler still believing that he could force reality to obey his wishes. But the battlefield was already answering him with its own logic, and that logic was simple. The offensive was alive, but it was also dying. At the moment when the German offensive began to lose its shape, the real battle at Lake Balaton was only starting to reveal itself. The first day had already exposed the fatal flaw in Hitler's plan. The attack depended on speed, but the ground had denied it from the beginning. Now that problem was becoming more severe with every passing hour. What had looked on paper like a powerful armored thrust was turning into a slow, grinding struggle through mud, traffic, minefields, and fire. The Germans were still dangerous. Their tanks were still formidable. Their infantry still moved with the discipline of professionals. But the battle was no longer about whether they could attack. It was about whether they could keep attacking before the whole operation locked up under its own weight. On the Soviet side, Tolbuchen's defense was beginning to work exactly as intended. The line was not built to stop the Germans all at once. It was built to absorb them, channel them, and drain them. Every German advance pushed deeper into prepared killing zones. Every road that carried armor forward also became a route for Soviet artillery to strike. Every attempt to widen the attack simply exposed the Germans to more of the same problem. The terrain would not allow them to spread out, and the Soviets would not allow them to settle in. This was where the battle became more than a clash of forces. It became a fight between an army that still believed momentum could save it and an army that already understood momentum was being destroyed. The SS formations pushed again on the second day, trying to regain the initiative. They had to. Once an offensive slows, it begins to lose its psychological weight as much as its tactical one. Tank crews stop feeling like hunters and start feeling like targets. Commanders stop thinking in terms of breakthroughs and start thinking in terms of survival. The Germans could feel that shift taking place. They could see that the battle was no longer moving in the direction Hitler had promised. And yet, the order remained the same. Keep going. The roads in the attack corridor were now packed with vehicles, damaged tanks, support vehicles, and traffic that could not flow freely because every unit needed the same narrow routes. In a battle of armored maneuver, congestion is almost as deadly as enemy fire. A tank stuck behind another tank is no longer a weapon. It is waiting to become a wreck. German crews were forced to waste time simply trying to move into position. The more they waited, the easier they became to track. The more they clustered, the more vulnerable they were to Soviet guns. The Soviets were not rushing. They did not need to. Their gun crews knew the terrain. Their officers had already identified the roads, the crossings, and the approaches most likely to carry the German main effort. They watched the German columns build up, then hit them where they were most exposed. Anti-tank fire came from positions the Germans often could not see until they were already inside the kill zone. Artillery cracked into the roots behind the forward elements. Mines, obstacles, and mud together turned every advance into a test of patience, endurance, and luck. The Germans still had superior tank crews in many cases, but superior crews cannot make bad ground disappear. One of the most dangerous things about this battle was the illusion that a local success could still change everything. That is what kept the offensive alive. When German units managed to gain a few kilometers, it gave the staff something to point to, something to report, something that looked like progress. But those gains were deceptive. They did not open the Soviet front. They did not create a clean route to the oil fields. They only deepened the German commitment to an attack that was already becoming too expensive to sustain. The more ground they took, the more they had to defend. The more they defended, the less they could push. The more they pushed, the more vulnerable they became to Soviet countermeasures. The operation was starting to feed on itself. By the third day, the battle had become a slow contest of attrition. German armor still moved in places, but not with the confidence required for a real breakthrough. Vehicles bogged down in soft ground. Some had to be abandoned or recovered under fire. Others were destroyed not because they were outmatched in direct combat, but because the battlefield itself was working against them. Spring thaw in Hungary had done what Soviet shells alone could not do. It had robbed the German tanks of mobility. Once mobility was gone, the rest followed quickly. The most elite formations in the Waffen-SS were finding themselves trapped in a kind of warfare they could not solve with bravery or technical skill. A Tiger II that cannot maneuver is no longer a threat to the battlefield as a whole. It may still be able to fire, and it may still be dangerous at range, but it cannot shape the fight. It cannot exploit a gap. It cannot turn a penetration into collapse. It cannot do the one thing armor is supposed to do in an offensive: keep moving. That reality was becoming impossible to hide. German commanders were now dealing with a battle that was beginning to break into pieces. Some attacks stalled completely. Some units found themselves unable to coordinate with neighboring formations because the traffic and terrain had already destroyed the rhythm of the advance. Communication became harder. Resupply became harder. Even basic movement between sectors took longer than expected. The offensive was still alive in a technical sense, but it was becoming weaker every hour. On the Soviet side, this was the moment Tolbuchen had planned for. Once the Germans had been slowed and stretched, the defense could begin to seal the openings and reinforce the most threatened sectors. Soviet reserves moved in where needed. Artillery continued to hammer the German approaches. Anti-tank units held their positions and waited for the next push. The Red Army did not need to win every local exchange. It only needed to make the Germans pay for each one until the offensive lost the strength to continue. That is what made the fighting so cruel. The Germans were not being smashed in one overwhelming blow. They were being methodically reduced. Every advance cost fuel. Every vehicle lost reduced future options. Every hour spent pushing against the Soviet line made the next hour harder. The army was using itself up, and there was no way to replace what was disappearing. By this point, the officers on the ground could already see the shape of failure. They could see the pace of the offensive collapsing. They could see the terrain choking the operation. They could see the Soviet defense adjusting and holding. What they could not do was change the logic of the order they had been given. Hitler had tied the operation to an objective that was too far away, in a battle that was too late, on a battlefield that refused to cooperate. That is why the second phase of Lake Balaton is so important. It is the point where the German army begins to understand that it is no longer fighting for a breakthrough. It is fighting to avoid collapse, while still pretending the breakthrough might somehow happen. That contradiction would soon break the offensive apart completely. For now, the fighting continued. The German tanks still pushed where they could. The Soviet guns still waited where they had to. The mud still held the battlefield in place like a trap that refused to open. And somewhere behind all of it, the one man who had demanded this offensive kept believing that willpower could still defeat reality. It could not. By the end of the second phase, the Germans had not won the tempo back. They had not found an easy route through the Soviet defense. They had not escaped the geography that was strangling them. Instead, they had only learned more clearly with each passing hour that the battle was moving toward a far worse stage. The real trap was closing. At that point, the battle stopped being a German offensive and became a Soviet execution. The third chapter of Lake Balaton is where the last illusion of control begins to collapse in full view. The Germans were still trying to fight like an attacking army, but the battle had already changed shape. The front no longer rewarded initiative. It punished it. Every attempt to push forward ran into another layer of prepared resistance, another gun line, another patch of ground that would not carry the weight of armor. The deeper the Germans went, the more the battle narrowed around them. By now, the Soviet defense had done more than just hold. It had absorbed the offensive, bent it, and started breaking it apart, piece by piece. German units that once moved as part of a coordinated armored thrust were now fighting in fragments. Some formations were still advancing. Others were stalled. Others were trying to recover disabled vehicles under fire, or clear routes that had already become blocked again. The offensive was no longer a single movement. It was a collection of emergencies. This is the moment where the battle becomes most dangerous, because the Germans are still powerful enough to hurt the Soviets, but not powerful enough to finish the job. That is the worst possible condition for an attacker. It creates local violence without strategic result. It keeps the casualty rate high while the objective gets farther away. And that is exactly what happened at Balaton. The Soviet commanders understood that the German effort was starting to overextend. So instead of chasing every attack point, they kept forcing the Germans to spend themselves against prepared positions. The armored assault had to pass through the same narrow corridor again and again, and every passage made it weaker. Tank crews that survived one fight found themselves sent back into another. Infantry that had marched forward under fire now had to hold the same broken ground. Support units struggled to keep pace. The entire army was beginning to fray at the edges. One of the reasons this part of the battle matters so much is that it destroys the idea that elite troops can overcome any circumstance. The Waffen-SS formations still had experience, firepower, and discipline. What they no longer had was an environment that allowed those strengths to matter fully. A formation can be elite and still be trapped. It can be aggressive and still be exhausted. It can be feared and still be doomed if the battlefield denies it the ability to turn combat skill into operational success. The terrain kept doing that. The spring mud deepened the problem. Roads remained clogged, crossings remained dangerous. The canal lines and waterlogged ground continued to channel movement into predictable routes. Soviet anti-tank guns had already been placed to dominate those routes, and now the Germans were running out of fresh ways to approach them. The battle was becoming repetitive in the most lethal way possible. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything happening was leading to the same result. German commanders began to notice something else too. Local tactical gains did not add up anymore. A captured ridge, a cleared road, a breached line, none of it produced the operational shift they needed. This is the hidden tragedy of late war offensives. The map still changes, but the war does not. That gap between movement and meaning is where armies die. At Balaton, the Germans were paying for every kilometer with tanks they could not replace and fuel they could not spare. That made each advance more and more self-defeating. A tank lost in March 1945 года was not just a battlefield casualty. It was a strategic irretrievability. It could not be replaced in time or in quantity, or perhaps at all. The same applied to experienced crews, veteran NCOs, and the small but critical amount of command cohesion that kept the whole machine functioning. Once that was gone, the armored force became less like a spear and more like a pile of expensive wreckage. The Soviets exploited that reality with increasing confidence. Their defense did not need dramatic movement. It needed timing. It needed fire discipline. It needed patience. The German attack had to keep exposing itself to be useful. Every exposure gave Soviet gunners another chance to destroy, delay, or disorganize it. By now, the German side was beginning to suffer the most dangerous kind of battlefield loss. The loss of initiative without the loss of contact. They were still in the fight, but no longer controlling it. There were moments in this phase where the German crews still managed to hit hard. That is important. The story does not work if the Germans suddenly become weak in a simple way. They were still dangerous, and Soviet units paid for every misstep. But those moments of success no longer changed the structure of the battle. They were flashes, not solutions. The offensive had entered the phase where heroism could only delay the outcome, not reverse it. And that is where the emotional tone of the battle changes. The first chapter was about decision. The second was about terrain and delay. The third is about realization. This is the stage where men on both sides begin to understand what kind of battle they are actually in. The Germans can feel the offensive losing its shape. The Soviets can feel the trap closing tighter. The front no longer feels like a contest between equal forces. It feels like one side trying to force a door open, while the other side slowly turns the lock. There is also a psychological break that happens here. Once an attack fails to achieve the expected breakthrough, every additional day of fighting becomes harder to justify. The troops still obey. The officers still give orders. But belief starts to drain out of the operation. The men in the vehicles know the difference between a difficult battle and a dead one. By this stage, Balaton was starting to look like the latter. That is why the third chapter should feel heavier than the second. The second chapter is tension. The third is compression. It should feel as though the whole battle is pressing inward, shrinking the space where the Germans still have options. The Soviet defense is not just resisting, It is reducing the enemy's future. That is a more frightening idea than a direct defeat, because it means the army is being consumed one decision at a time. By the end of this phase, the Germans had still not achieved the decisive result Hitler demanded. They were still pushing, but each push now had the feeling of a final effort made in a narrowing corridor. The men had less room, the machines had less room, and the entire operation had less room to exist. That is the point where the battle stops looking like an offensive and starts looking like something already dying under the surface. By the time the fourth phase of the battle began, the Germans were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for the right to retreat in something resembling order. That is what Lake Balaton had become by March 1945. Not a last great armored triumph, but the final collapse of a force that had once been feared across Europe. The offensive had consumed its own momentum. The terrain had stolen the speed. The Soviet defense had absorbed the Oder and kept standing. And now the only question left was how much of the 6th SS Panzer Army would survive long enough to escape the trap. Hitler still had not accepted what the battlefield had already made obvious. The offensive had failed. The oil had not been seized. The Soviet line had not broken. The last major German armored gamble of the war had turned into a slow disaster, and yet the men on the ground were still being ordered to push, hold, and die for an objective that was disappearing in real time. That is what made the final stage so bitter. The battle had stopped being about movement long before anyone in Berlin admitted it. Tolbuchen's counter-pressure now made the German position even worse. Once the Soviet command understood that the offensive was exhausting itself, the Red Army began to shift from defense to exploitation. The point was no longer just to hold the line. It was to strike back while the German formations were stretched, tired, and increasingly unable to respond as a coherent force. This was the moment the Germans had feared from the beginning, because every kilometer they had gained now turned into a liability. The deeper they had gone, the harder the withdrawal would be. And the withdrawal came under fire. German units that had spent days clawing forward now found themselves trying to pull back through the same narrow roads, the same flooded fields, the same clogged crossings that had already ruined the attack. Retreat in such conditions is often harder than attack, because the army must move while exposed, with damaged vehicles, exhausted crews, and commanders trying to preserve whatever order remains. At Balaton, the road system that had failed to support the offensive was now failing to support the escape. Some tanks had to be abandoned. Others broke down and could not be recovered. Some crews simply ran out of fuel before they could get clear. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in the battle. Germany was now so short of fuel that some of its best armor could still fight, but could not always move when movement was needed most. A tank with shells and no gasoline is not a weapon of war. It is a steel coffin with a cannon attached to it. On the Soviet side, the pressure kept increasing. Red Army forces pressed into the gaps, attacked the flanks, and forced the Germans to keep turning back to face new threats while trying to pull out of the old ones. This made the German retreat break into pieces. A retreat only works when it remains controlled. Once it starts to fragment, it becomes a pursuit. And once it becomes a pursuit, the side that is leaving behind the battlefield begins to lose far more than ground. That was what Tolbuchen wanted. Not a dramatic single annihilation, but a systematic stripping away of German combat power. The offensive had already failed. Now, the retreat would cost the rest. The men of the Waffen-SS had still fought hard, and that should not be blurred away in the final accounting. These were not hollow formations of paper and slogans. They were hardened troops who had been through years of war and knew exactly how dangerous they were. But by this stage, even their skill could not undo the conditions around them. They were trapped inside a battle that had become a math problem with no good answer. Too little fuel, too little time, too much mud, too much Soviet fire, too many miles between their surviving units and any real safety. And then came the moment that said everything about the offensive's final collapse. Vehicles that should have been priceless were being left behind in working condition. That image is one of the most striking of the entire battle. Not only destroyed wrecks, but intact tanks abandoned because the crews could no longer take them with them. The battle had drained the Germans so thoroughly that some of their own machines became useless, simply because there was no way to keep them moving. The Soviet troops advancing afterward found the landscape littered with Panthers, assault guns, and heavy tanks sitting where their crews had left them, waiting for recovery that would never come. It was not just a defeat, it was a disappearance of capacity. This is where the history of Lake Balaton becomes something more than a battlefield report. It becomes a portrait of the end. The Germans were not just losing territory, they were losing their ability to remain a fighting force in the way they had been only months earlier. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which had entered the battle as Hitler's chosen armored fist, was coming out of it wounded, drained, and stripped of the confidence that had once made it so feared. The Soviets did not need to celebrate wildly to understand what had happened. They could see it in the wreckage, the abandoned vehicles, the exhausted prisoners, the broken formations trying to pull westward in the hope of surviving the collapse of the Reich. The battle had not merely failed, it had revealed the exact condition of the German war machine in its final weeks. Dangerous, still armed, still disciplined in places, but fundamentally out of time. And that is why the ending of this story matters so much. Lake Balaton was not just another late war offensive that ended badly. It was the last major German armored push of the Second World War, and it ended the way the war itself was ending. Everywhere else, not with a grand reversal, but with exhaustion, fragmentation, and the quiet recognition that nothing left in the German arsenal could change the outcome anymore. The oil fields Hitler wanted were not enough to save the Reich. The elite SS formations were not enough to force a breakthrough. The tanks, the guns, the orders, the speeches, the promises, none of it could reverse the fact that the war had already been decided. The Soviet advance continued. Vienna was next. Berlin would fall after that. And the men who had been sent into the Hungarian mud for one last impossible gamble were left behind in a battlefield that had become a graveyard for the last illusion of German power. What remains, after all the noise, is almost silent. A field in Hungary, a burned-out road, a tank sitting crooked in the mud, abandoned and still upright, and a regime that spent its final strength trying to win back a future it had already lost. Istochniki.